Sometimes the weight of losing someone you love can drive a man to walk through hell itself, just for one more chance to say goodbye. For 3 brutal winters in the Colorado mountains, that's exactly what Hollis Kane has been doing. This former lawman and his loyal husky Rue have knocked on every cabin door for miles, searching for answers about the woman who vanished from his life one snowy December morning. All he found was her carved locket and blood in the snow. Most folks think he's lost his mind. Others whisper he's haunted by ghosts. But Hollis keeps walking, keeps knocking, keeps hoping that somewhere behind one of those wooden doors lies the truth about what happened to the only person who ever truly mattered to him. What happens when he finally finds the cabin he's been looking for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worn leather journal sat open on Hollis Kane's kitchen table, its pages filled with careful handwriting that documented 3 years of searching. Each entry began the same way: date, weather conditions, cabin visited, occupants encountered, outcome. The methodical record of a man who had once worn a badge and believed in the power of evidence, now reduced to tracking disappointment after disappointment in faded ink. Sheriff Hollis Kane had been a different man 4 years ago, before the world tilted sideways and left him grasping for something solid to hold on to. Back then, his days followed a comfortable rhythm in Silver Creek, a mountain town where folks still tipped their hats and knew each other's troubles. He'd worn the tin badge with quiet pride, not the kind that came from chasing glory, but the satisfaction of being useful to people who deserved protection from the harsh realities that sometimes wandered down from the high country. The badge sat in his desk drawer now, tarnished and forgotten, replaced by something far more precious: the memory of Sarah McKenna and the way she'd changed everything simply by walking into Mabel's diner on a Tuesday morning in late spring. Sarah had arrived in Silver Creek like morning mist, appearing so naturally that folks couldn't quite remember the exact moment she became part of their lives. She'd taken a job at the diner, served coffee with a smile that reached her unusual grey-green eyes, and rented the small apartment above the hardware store. Nothing remarkable about any of it, except for the way she looked at the mountains, not with the casual appreciation of someone passing through, but with the wary respect of someone who understood their danger. Hollis had noticed her immediately, though he'd been careful not to show it. At 38, he'd grown comfortable with his bachelor ways, content with his evening walks and weekend fishing trips. But Sarah McKenna had a quality that drew attention without demanding it, a stillness that suggested depths worth exploring. Their courtship unfolded slowly, like seasons changing in the high country. Coffee at Mabel's became deliberate visits during his rounds. Those visits became conversations that stretched longer than necessary. The conversations became walks along Silver Creek, where Sarah would pause to listen to the water and Hollis would watch her face, memorizing the way she looked when she thought no one was observing. You ever wonder what it would be like to just disappear? She'd asked him once, standing on the creek bank with her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. To walk into those trees and never come back? Can't say I have, Hollis had answered, though her question stirred something uneasy in his chest. Most folks around here, they've got roots that go too deep for that kind of thinking. Sarah had smiled then, but it hadn't reached her eyes. Lucky them. It took 6 months before she agreed to dinner at his cabin, another 3 before she let him kiss her properly, and nearly a year before she said she loved him back. By then, Hollis was already planning their future with the careful attention he brought to everything that mattered. He'd found the ring in Denver, a simple band with a small diamond that caught the light the way her eyes did when she laughed. Sarah had been the one to suggest getting a dog. They'd driven to the shelter in Leadville on a Saturday morning, intending to look at a border collie mix the volunteer had recommended. Instead, they'd come home with Rue, a grey husky with mismatched eyes, one brown, one blue, and a stubborn streak that matched Sarah's independent spirit. He chose us, Sarah had said, laughing as the young dog tangled himself in his leash, trying to investigate every scent in the parking lot. Look at him, he's already planning our walks. Rue had adapted to cabin life with the same ease Sarah had shown settling into Silver Creek. The three of them developed routines that felt as natural as breathing. Morning coffee on the porch, evening walks along the old mining trails, weekend trips into the high country where Sarah would sketch the landscape while Rue chased marmots and Hollis pretended to fish. Those were the golden months, when Hollis allowed himself to believe that happiness was something a man could build and keep safe. Sarah had begun talking about expanding the cabin, maybe adding a room for the children they'd have someday. She'd planted a garden that spring, spending hours on her knees in the dark soil, coaxing life from the harsh mountain earth. This place could be something special, she'd told him, wiping dirt from her hands as she surveyed the neat rows of vegetables. A real home. Hollis had kissed her then, tasting earth and possibility on her lips, and wondered if a man could die from too much contentment. The proposal had been simple, the way Sarah preferred things. No grand gestures or public displays, just the two of them sitting on the porch swing after dinner, Rue sprawled at their feet, watching the last light fade from the peaks. Hollis had pulled the ring from his pocket and asked if she'd marry him, and Sarah had said yes, with tears in her eyes and her hands shaking as she slipped the band onto her finger. They'd set the date for the following June, planning a small ceremony in the meadow behind the cabin where the wildflowers would be in full bloom. Sarah had been particular about the details. She wanted Pastor Williams to officiate, wanted Mabel to make the cake, wanted the whole thing to feel like Silver Creek, like home. "I never thought I'd have this," she'd whispered to him one night in November, curled against his chest while a storm rattled the windows. A real life with someone who... She'd stopped herself, the way she sometimes did when conversations drifted toward her past. Someone who what? Hollis had asked, but Sarah had already fallen asleep, leaving him to wonder what she'd been about to say. December 15th had dawned clear and cold, the kind of morning that promised good weather for most of the day. Sarah had been up early, humming while she made coffee, excited about a trip to town to order flowers for the wedding. She'd kissed Hollis goodbye at the door, scratched Rue behind the ears, and promised to pick up supplies for the Christmas decorations they'd planned to hang that evening. "Love you," she'd called back to him as she climbed into her truck. Words that hung in the crisp air like visible breath. Those were the last words she'd spoken to him. When Sarah hadn't returned by dark, Hollis had driven every road between the cabin and town, his headlights sweeping the ditches and turnarounds where a vehicle might have gone off the pavement. He'd found her truck 2 miles from the cabin, parked perfectly normal beside the road, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat with her wallet intact. The only signs of trouble were the carved wooden locket she'd worn every day since he'd known her, lying in the snow 10 feet from the driver's door, and the dark stains that had frozen into the white ground beneath it. Hollis had called in every favor, had brought in search teams and tracking dogs, had spent 3 weeks combing every inch of the surrounding wilderness. They'd found nothing. No trail, no evidence, no explanation for how someone could simply vanish from a lonely stretch of mountain road. The investigation had consumed his days and haunted his nights. He'd questioned every person in a 50-mile radius, had followed leads that led nowhere, had slowly watched hope drain from the faces of the volunteers who'd initially been so eager to help. By January, the official search had been called off. The case filed as an open missing person investigation with no active leads. That's when Hollis had started his own search, trading his badge and his old life for a worn leather journal and a quest that had no clear end. If the wilderness wouldn't give up Sarah's secrets, then he'd ask every human soul in these mountains until someone told him what had happened to the woman he loved. 3 winters had passed since that December morning, and Hollis Kane had become a different man entirely. The cabin felt hollow without Sarah's presence, empty except for Rue's steady companionship and the memories that seemed to echo in every room. But the journal remained, growing thicker with each passing season. a testament to a love that refused to accept the finality of loss. The carved wooden locket had become Hollis's compass, though it pointed toward heartbreak instead of true north. He carried it in his shirt pocket, feeling its weight with every step as he and Rue began their systematic canvass of the mountain settlements that first winter after Sarah's disappearance. January's cold cut through a man's bones like judgment, but Hollis welcomed the punishment. Physical pain was easier to bear than the hollow ache that had taken residence in his chest since that December morning. Rue seemed to understand their mission without explanation, falling into step beside Hollis as they approached each isolated cabin, each weather-beaten homestead scattered across the unforgiving landscape. Their method was simple and thorough. Hollis would knock, introduce himself as former Sheriff Kane, and ask if anyone had seen Sarah McKenna. He carried her photograph, the one from her wallet where she was smiling at something just outside the camera's view, and he'd watch, faces carefully as people studied the image. The first dozen cabins yielded nothing but polite sympathy and offers of coffee that Hollis always declined. Folks remembered hearing about the missing woman, expressed their condolences, shook their heads when shown the photograph. Most suggested he should let the matter rest, that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, that the mountains kept their secrets for good reason. But at the 13th cabin, an old trapper named Pete Hendricks studied Sarah's photograph for a long time before handing it back with trembling fingers. "Pretty woman," Pete had said, not meeting Hollis's eyes. "Shame what happened to her. What do you know about what happened?" Hollis pressed, sensing something beneath the old man's careful words. Pete had glanced around his small cabin as if checking for listeners, then stepped outside, despite the bitter wind. "Some things a man sees, he wishes he hadn't. Some things he hears, he wishes would stay buried." Rue had growled low in his throat, a sound Hollis had never heard from the usually friendly dog. The husky's mismatched eyes were fixed on something in the distance, his body tense with an alertness that raised the hair on Hollis's neck. "Tell me what you saw." "Pete." The old trapper had worked his jaw like he was chewing tough meat, considering his words. "Might have seen a woman matching that description. Couple weeks before Christmas, maybe 3. She was walking the old mining road that leads up toward Widow's Peak. Walking. Her truck was found 2 miles from my cabin." "Didn't say she was alone," Pete replied. "Said I saw a woman. Didn't say nothing about who might have been encouraging her to take that particular walk." The implications hit Hollis like a physical blow. "You're saying someone took her?" "I'm saying a woman don't usually choose to walk 12 miles through snowdrifts in the middle of December unless she's got compelling reasons." Pete's weathered face had creased with something that might have been pity. "And I'm saying that some of the folks living up near Widow's Peak, they don't much care for questions about their business." Hollis had pressed for details, but Pete had clammed up, claiming he'd already said more than was wise. The old man had retreated into his cabin and refused to answer when Hollis knocked again, though smoke continued to rise from his chimney and shadows moved behind the covered windows. That night, encamped in a grove of aspen trees, with Rue pressed warm against his side, Hollis had studied his maps by firelight. Widow's Peak was a brutal climb, even in good weather, accessible only by a narrow trail that switchbacked through deadfall and loose rock. Several cabins were marked in that area, most belonging to the kind of people who'd chosen isolation for reasons they didn't care to share. "What do you think, boy?" Hollis had asked, scratching behind Rue's ears. "Think Pete was telling the truth or just spinning tales to get rid of us?" Rue had whined softly and nuzzled closer, as if sensing the direction of Hollis's thoughts. The dog had loved Sarah with the pure devotion that only animals could offer, had waited by the door for weeks after her disappearance, expecting her return. If Sarah was somewhere up that mountain alive, or Hollis forced himself not to finish that thought. The next morning brought fresh snow and a wind that cut like broken glass. But Hollis packed his gear and began the climb toward Widow's Peak. The trail was treacherous, made worse by drifts that sometimes reached his waist and ice that turned every step into a calculated risk. Rue managed better. his thick coat and sure feet carrying him over terrain that left Hollis gasping and stumbling. 3 hours into the climb, they encountered their first cabin, a ramshackle structure that looked abandoned until smoke from the chimney proved otherwise. Hollis's knock was answered by a woman in her 50s, thin as a rail and suspicious as a cornered cat. "We don't get visitors up here," she'd said, keeping the door mostly closed and her hand on what looked like a rifle stock. "Especially not strangers asking questions. I'm looking for someone," Hollis had explained, showing Sarah's photograph. "A woman who might have come this way in December." The woman had barely glanced at the picture. "Don't know nothing about no missing woman. And if I did, wouldn't be my business to say." It was the same response at the next cabin and the one after that. A wall of deliberate ignorance that felt rehearsed, coordinated. By the time Hollis reached the 4th cabin, his patience was wearing thin and his suspicions were growing stronger. This cabin was different, newer construction, well-maintained, with expensive-looking snowmobiles parked under a lean-to shelter. The man who answered the door was younger than the others, maybe 40, with the kind of hard eyes that Hollis had learned to recognize during his years in law enforcement. Jacob Morse, the man had introduced himself, though his tone suggested the name might not be entirely genuine. "You're the fellow been asking around about some woman?" "That's right." "Sarah McKenna. She disappeared in December." Jacob had studied the photograph with more attention than the others had shown, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Pretty thing. Shame to lose someone like that. You recognize her?" "Can't say I do. But then, we mind our own business up here. Find it works better that way." Jacob's smile held no warmth. Less complications. Rue had begun that low growling again, positioning himself between Hollis and Jacob in a way that suggested the dog's instincts were picking up signals Hollis might have missed. The husky's behavior had been increasingly agitated as they climbed higher, as if familiar scents were triggering memories Hollis wished he could access. "My dog seems to think he's been here before," Hollis had said, watching Jacob's face carefully. Dogs get confused in new territory. All these pine trees probably smell the same to him. But Jacob had taken a step backward, and his hand had moved closer to the rifle Hollis could now see, leaning against the doorframe. The conversation had ended there, with polite but unmistakable warnings about the dangers of traveling alone in winter weather, and suggestions that Hollis might want to head back down the mountain before the afternoon storms rolled in. But as Hollis and Rue had walked away, he'd felt eyes watching from behind the cabin's windows, and he'd noticed tracks in the snow that looked like they'd been made by someone trying to avoid detection. That evening, as they camped in a sheltered spot halfway down the mountain, Hollis had made his first journal entry about what would become 3 years of systematic searching. January 18th. Clear, cold. Visited 4 cabins near Widow's Peak. General hostility and evasion. Jacob Morse at the uppermost cabin showed recognition when shown S's photograph, though he denied it. Rue's behavior suggests familiarity with the area. Pete Hendricks may have seen S walking toward this region. Need to return when weather improves and investigate more thoroughly, as he'd written. Rue had pressed against his side and whined softly, the sound carrying a note of distress that went straight to Hollis's heart. The dog understood somehow that they were looking for Sarah, that she was supposed to be with them but wasn't, that the world had become wrong in a way that couldn't be fixed by loyalty or patience or love. "We'll find her." "Boy," Hollis had promised, though the words tasted like ashes in the cold air. "However long it takes, wherever she is, we'll find her." But even then, some part of him had wondered if finding her would bring the peace he sought, or if some discoveries were too terrible to survive. The mountains held their secrets closely, and 3 winters of searching had taught Hollis that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The hand-drawn map, spread across Hollis's kitchen table, told a story of obsession marked in careful X's and meticulous notes. Each symbol represented a door knocked, a conversation attempted, a hope disappointed. By the time the second winter began, The map resembled a military campaign, more than a search for a missing person. Martha Kellam had been the first person to offer genuine kindness instead of polite dismissal. Her cabin sat in a sheltered valley 15 miles west of Silver Creek, surrounded by aspens that turned the autumn landscape into something from a painting. She'd opened her door on a November afternoon when the first serious snow was beginning to fall, taken one look at Hollis and Rue standing on her porch, and invited them inside without waiting for explanations. "You're the man looking for that missing woman," she'd said, setting coffee to brew while Rue settled gratefully by her wood stove. "Heard about you from folks in town. Been wondering when you'd make it out this way." Martha was perhaps 60, with silver hair braided down her back and the kind of practical competence that came from living alone in country that didn't forgive mistakes. Her husband had died in a mining accident 5 years earlier, but she'd chosen to stay in their cabin rather than move to town, supporting herself with quilting and the occasional hunting guide work for city folks who wanted an authentic mountain experience. "I don't suppose you knew Sarah McKenna," Hollis had said, settling into the chair she indicated while accepting the coffee with grateful hands. "Can't say I did personally, but I heard plenty about her. Small communities like ours, news travels faster than wildfire." Martha had studied Hollis with shrewd eyes. "Also heard you gave up your badge to go looking for her. That tells me something about the kind of love you two shared." The directness of her observation had caught Hollis off guard. Most people danced around the subject of his search, treating it like an embarrassing obsession they were too polite to criticize openly. Martha's matter-of-fact acceptance felt like absolution he hadn't known he needed. "She was everything to me," he'd admitted, the words coming easier than they had in months. "Is everything to me. Until I know what happened, I won't stop looking." Martha had nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Course you won't. A man doesn't walk away from love like that. Question is, you prepared for whatever you might find?" It was a question that haunted him more with each passing day. As winter deepened and his search expanded, Hollis began encountering stories that chilled him worse than the mountain cold. Martha had been the first to mention them, sitting by her fire on that November evening, while snow gathered against the windows. "There have been others," she'd said quietly, refilling his coffee cup. "Women who've gone missing in these mountains over the years. Not often, maybe one every couple years, but enough to make a pattern if you're paying attention." "What kind of pattern?" "Always women traveling alone. Always found abandoned vehicles with no sign of struggle. Always during winter months when the search gets called off faster." Martha's voice had carried the weight of accumulated sorrow. "Most folks assume they wandered off and got lost in the cold. But I've lived in these mountains my whole life, and I know the difference between getting lost and getting taken." The implications had settled over Hollis like a heavy blanket. "You think someone's been taking women?" "I think there are men in these mountains who've learned that winter makes a good accomplice. Storm covers tracks, cold kills scent trails. Snow buries evidence until spring melt, if there's anything left to find by then." Rue had raised his head from his place by the fire, ears pricked, as if he understood the conversation. The dog had been different since their trip to Widow's Peak, more alert, more protective. Sometimes Hollis caught him staring into the distance, with an intensity that suggested he was remembering something important, something connected to Sarah. "Your dog's got good instincts," Martha had observed, watching Rue's behavior. "Animals pick up on things we miss. He knows this is dangerous territory." Over the following weeks, as Hollis expanded his search pattern to include more remote settlements, he began collecting the stories Martha had mentioned. A woman from Denver whose car was found near Kenosha Pass 3 winters earlier. A teacher from Leadville who'd vanished while hiking alone 2 summers before Sarah's disappearance. A journalist investigating mining claims who'd disappeared the previous spring. A rental car found pristine and empty on a Forest Service road. Each story followed the same pattern Martha had described. Women traveling alone. Abandoned vehicles, no traces despite extensive searches. The local authorities had investigated each case thoroughly, but the vastness of the Colorado wilderness and the harsh conditions that followed each disappearance had frustrated their efforts. It's like they just evaporated. Deputy Tom Morrison had told Hollis during one of their unofficial conversations. Tom had been a friend since Hollis's sheriff days, and he'd been generous with information despite departmental policies about sharing case files with civilians. No physical evidence, no witnesses, no logical explanation. Just gone. You think they're connected? Can't prove it, but yeah. My gut says someone's been hunting women in these mountains for years. Someone who knows the terrain well enough to make people disappear without a trace. The idea had consumed Hollis's thoughts as he continued his methodical canvass of the high country. His map grew more complex, marked not just with X's for cabins visited, but with different symbols for useful contacts, suspicious responses, and locations that triggered unusual reactions from Rue. The husky had become an integral part of the investigation. Rue's behavior at certain locations provided clues that human observation might miss, the way he'd tense when approaching specific cabins, how he'd whine and pull away from certain trails, the aggressive posturing he'd display around particular individuals. At a cabin near Cameron Pass, Rue had refused to approach the front door, instead circling the building with his hackles raised until Hollis had abandoned the visit entirely. Later, Tom Morrison had mentioned that the cabin's owner, a man named Carl Brennan, had been questioned in connection with 2 of the earlier disappearances, but had never been charged due to lack of evidence. Rue knew, Martha had said when Hollis described the incident during one of his regular visits to her cabin. Dogs can smell fear, smell violence. That animal's trying to keep you safe. The relationship with Martha had become a lifeline during those dark winter months. Her cabin served as a base camp for his extended searches, and her practical wisdom helped him process the increasingly disturbing information he was gathering. She fed him when he forgot to eat, provided medical attention when the harsh conditions took their toll, and offered the kind of straightforward companionship that didn't require explanations or justifications. "You're wearing yourself down to bone," she'd observed one evening in February, watching him update his map with the day's disappointing results. "What happens to that woman if you kill yourself looking for her?" It was a fair question, one that Hollis had been avoiding as his search consumed more of his physical and emotional reserves. The isolation was taking its toll, the constant disappointment wearing away at his optimism like water-carving stone. But every time he considered scaling back his efforts, he'd remember Sarah's laugh or the way she'd looked at him when she'd said yes to his proposal. And the fire would rekindle. "I keep thinking I'm getting close," he'd told Martha, tracing the patterns on his map with a finger that shook slightly from fatigue. "Like there's something just out of reach, some connection I'm missing." Maybe there is. But maybe you need to change how you're looking for it. That advice would prove prophetic in ways Hollis couldn't yet imagine. The broken compass had been Sarah's, found among her belongings after she disappeared. Hollis carried it now as a reminder that sometimes losing your way was the only path to truth. As the second winter deepened into its harshest months, he began to realize that his methodical search might be leading him further from answers rather than closer to them. The physical toll was becoming undeniable. Hollis had lost 20 pounds since beginning his quest, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been solid muscle and comfortable confidence. His hands shook when he was tired. His sleep was fractured by dreams that left him gasping in the darkness. And there were mornings when getting out of bed required an act of will that surprised him with its difficulty. Rue wasn't faring much better. The husky's thick coat and natural endurance had served them well through 2 brutal winters, but even his remarkable resilience had limits. The dog moved more slowly now, his breathing labored after long climbs, his usual enthusiasm dampened by exhaustion and the stress of their endless searching. "You 2 are running yourselves into the ground," Martha had told him bluntly during one of his visits to her cabin. "What good are you going to be to that woman if you're too worn out to think straight when you finally find her?" But Hollis couldn't slow down, not when each new lead felt like it might be the one that broke the case open. The Brennan family had provided just such a lead, though not in the way he'd expected. He'd found their cabin tucked into a grove of pine trees near the headwaters of the Arkansas River, a substantial log structure that suggested prosperity unusual for the remote location. The family had been welcoming in a way that immediately set them apart from the suspicious responses he'd grown accustomed to. "Of course we remember Sarah McKenna," Emma Brennan had said, inviting Hollis and Rue inside for coffee and fresh bread. "Sweet girl. Helped us out of a jam a couple years back when our youngest took sick." Emma was a sturdy woman in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of calm competence that came from raising children in difficult country. Her husband, Frank, worked timber contracts in the National Forest, and their 3 grown children had all settled within a day's ride of the family cabin. Sarah knew about healing, Frank had added, settling his considerable bulk into a chair that creaked under his weight. Had knowledge of plants and such that you don't usually find in young folks. Saved our boy Tommy when the fever wouldn't break. The revelation that Sarah had visited the Brennan family had sent excitement coursing through Hollis's tired mind. Finally, someone who had actually known her, who could provide details about her life that might explain her disappearance. "When was this?" he'd asked, pulling out his worn notebook to record the information. "Must have been 2 summers before she went missing," Emma had replied thoughtfully. "July, maybe August. She was hiking alone, which seemed odd for a woman in those days, but she handled herself well enough. Hiking alone. She told me she'd never done much outdoor recreation before coming to Silver Creek." Frank and Emma had exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that long marriages produced. "Well," Emma had said carefully, "maybe she was just being modest. Girl knew her way around the wilderness better than most men we've known." The conversation had continued for 2 hours, revealing details about Sarah that left Hollis feeling like he was learning about a stranger. According to the Brennans, Sarah had possessed extensive knowledge of wilderness survival, had carried gear that suggested serious backcountry experience, and had demonstrated medical skills that went far beyond basic first aid. "She ever mentioned where she learned all this?" Hollis had pressed. "Said she'd grown up in rough country," Frank had replied. "Didn't elaborate much, but she had the look of someone who'd seen hard times. You know the type, careful around strangers, always checking her surroundings, never quite relaxed even when she was being friendly. You think she was running from something?" Another of those meaningful glances between husband and wife. "Wasn't our business to ask," Emma had said diplomatically, "but a woman doesn't develop those kinds of skills or that kind of watchfulness unless she's had reasons." The implications had followed Hollis and Rue back down the mountain like pursuing wolves. Sarah had lied to him, not about important things perhaps, but about fundamental aspects of her identity. The woman he'd fallen in love with, the woman he'd planned to marry, had been someone other than who she'd claimed to be. That night, camped in the shelter of a rock overhang while snow fell steadily outside, Hollis had forced himself to reconsider everything he thought he knew about Sarah McKenna. Her reluctance to talk about her past, her occasional moments of hypervigilance, her surprising competence in practical matters that should have been foreign to a diner waitress from back east. "What weren't you telling me, Sarah?" he'd asked the darkness, while Rue pressed warm against his side. "What were you so afraid of that you couldn't trust me with the truth?" The questions multiplied as spring arrived and his search expanded. A trapper near Rabbit Ears Pass remembered a woman matching Sarah's description, who had traded medical supplies for winter gear 3 years before her disappearance. A rancher outside Kremling recalled seeing her at a gun shop, purchasing ammunition for a pistol with the kind of casual, a competence that suggested familiarity with firearms. Each revelation added another layer to the mystery while simultaneously undermining Hollis's confidence in his own memories. Had he been so blinded by love that he'd missed obvious signs of deception? Or had Sarah been so skilled at maintaining false identities that even someone with law enforcement experience couldn't see through her performance? The broken compass became a metaphor for more than just Sarah's lost directions. Hollis began to feel like he was navigating without reliable landmarks, uncertain whether his search was taking him toward truth or deeper into delusion. Maybe the question isn't what happened to her, Martha had suggested during one of their late-night conversations by her fireplace. Maybe the question is who she really was and why she needed to hide it. It was a perspective that required Hollis to acknowledge possibilities he'd been avoiding. If Sarah had been living under a false identity, then her disappearance might not have been a random crime or an accident. It might have been connected to whatever had driven her to create a new life in Silver Creek. "You think someone found her?" he'd asked Martha. "Someone from her past?" "I think a woman with that kind of training and those kinds of secrets doesn't vanish without good reason. Question is whether she left voluntarily or whether someone made the choice for her." The distinction mattered more than Hollis wanted to admit. If Sarah had chosen to disappear, then his 3-year search was an exercise in futility, pursuing someone who didn't want to be found. If she'd been taken against her will, then every day of delay might be bringing him closer to discovering something he wasn't prepared to handle. As winter grudgingly gave way to spring, Hollis found himself standing at a crossroads that had nothing to do with mountain trails. He could continue his systematic search, accepting that the woman he'd loved might have been someone entirely different from who he'd thought. Or he could abandon the quest and try to rebuild a life that wasn't defined by loss and unanswered questions. Rue made the decision for him. On a warm April morning, while they were camped near the site where Sarah's truck had been found, the husky suddenly raised his head and began moving with purposeful direction toward a section of forest they'd searched dozens of times before. But this time was different. This time, Rue was following a scent trail that set his entire body trembling with recognition and anticipation. The broken compass might not point toward true north anymore, but Rue's instincts were leading them somewhere that mattered. Hollis packed his gear and followed, knowing that whatever they found would either provide the answers he'd been seeking or destroy the last remnants of the illusions he'd been carrying. The torn photograph had been tucked between the pages of a water-damaged book, half of a family portrait that raised more questions than it answered. Hollis found it in an abandoned cabin near Timberline, a structure so remote that reaching it required 2 days of hiking through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. As the third winter approached, Hollis had become something of a ghost himself, moving through the high country with the single-minded determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. His contact with civilization had dwindled to occasional visits with Martha and infrequent trips to Silver Creek for supplies. Most folks had stopped asking about his search, treating him with the careful politeness reserved for the walking wounded. Rue had aged visibly during their years of wandering. The husky's muzzle showed grey now, and his once boundless energy had given way to the measured pace of an older dog who understood the value of conserving strength. But his devotion remained absolute, his willingness to follow Hollis into increasingly dangerous territory, a testament to loyalties that transcended human understanding. The abandoned cabin had been a lucky discovery, if luck was the right word for finding evidence of tragedy. They'd been following a game trail that seemed to lead nowhere when Rue had suddenly veered off the path, drawn by some scent or instinct that Hollis couldn't detect. The structure had been invisible from more than 50 yards away, tucked into a natural depression and overgrown with mountain shrubs that provided perfect camouflage. "Someone wanted this place to stay hidden," Hollis had muttered, pushing through the undergrowth that partially blocked the doorway. The cabin's construction was recent enough to suggest it had been built within the last decade, but rough enough to indicate that concealment had been more important than comfort. Inside, the single room showed signs of recent habitation despite the apparent abandonment. A wood stove still held partially burned logs. Dishes sat stacked beside a hand pump sink, and clothing hung from pegs driven into the log walls. But everything was covered with the fine layer of dust that accumulates when human presence stops disrupting the natural order. Rue had immediately begun a systematic investigation of the space, his nose working overtime as he catalogued scents that told stories Hollis could only guess at. The dog's behavior suggested familiarity, but also distress. He'd whine softly while investigating certain areas. His tail held low in a way that indicated anxiety rather than excitement. The torn photograph had been Hollis's most significant discovery, though its meaning remained frustratingly unclear. The image showed a family group, parents and 3 children, posed in front of what looked like a government building. But the photograph had been deliberately torn in half, leaving only the mother and 1 child visible, while removing whatever or whoever had occupied the right side of the frame. The woman in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Sarah, though her hair was darker and her expression held a hardness that Hollis had never seen in his fiancée's face. The child beside her was perhaps 10 years old, a girl with serious eyes and the kind of rigid posture that suggested familiarity with formal occasions. "Is this you, Sarah?" Hollis had asked the empty cabin, studying the photograph by lamplight while Rue dozed fitfully beside the cold stove. "Is this who you were before Silver Creek?" Other items in the cabin suggested a life lived in careful preparation for departure. Multiple sets of identification documents were hidden in a coffee can, each bearing different names, but all featuring photographs of the same woman. Sarah McKenna was among them, along with Elena Rodriguez, Mary Catherine Walsh, and Jennifer Ann Parks. Each identity was complete with social security cards, driver's licenses, and credit cards in various stages of use and expiration. The implications were staggering. Sarah hadn't simply been hiding her past. She'd been systematically creating and discarding identities with the kind of professional competence that suggested either criminal activity or law enforcement training. The woman Hollis had loved and planned to marry had been living a life so deeply constructed that every aspect of their relationship might have been calculated deception, but other evidence in the cabin told a different story. A journal hidden beneath loose floorboards contained entries that revealed genuine emotion and internal struggle. The handwriting was Sarah's, though the content described experiences and fears that she'd never shared with Hollis. March 15th, 3 months in Silver Creek now. Starting to feel safe for the first time in years? The sheriff seems like a good man, and I find myself wanting to trust him with more than I should. Dangerous thinking. I can't forget what happened to the others who let their guard down. June 8th, Hollis asked me about my family today. I lied again, told him they were all dead. In a way, it's true. The person I was before is dead, and the family I had exists only in memories I can't afford to revisit. But the lies are getting harder to maintain, especially when he looks at me like I'm something precious. September 22nd. I think I'm falling in love with him, which is the most foolish thing I could possibly do. Love makes you vulnerable, makes you want to share truths that could get people killed. But watching him work, seeing how he cares about the people in this town, I start to imagine what it might be like to stop running. The entries painted a picture of a woman caught between genuine emotion and calculated survival. Someone who desperately wanted the normal life she'd built with Hollis, but who understood that her past made such happiness impossible. Doc Harrison had provided another piece of the puzzle when Hollis finally worked up the courage to ask direct questions about Sarah's medical history. The old physician had been reluctant to discuss patient confidentiality, but Hollis's desperation and their long friendship had eventually loosened his tongue. She came to me twice during her time in Silver Creek, Doc had admitted, settling into his office chair with the weariness of a man who'd seen too much human suffering. Once for a routine checkup, and once for something that wasn't routine at all. What kind of something? She had scars, Hollis. Old ones, professional ones. The kind you get from somebody who knows how to use a knife for persuasion rather than killing. Doc's weathered hands had trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee, and she had a tattoo that she wanted removed. Small thing on her wrist looked like numbers. Numbers. Government style. The kind they use for identification in certain situations. Doc had met Hollis's eyes with a look that conveyed understanding without requiring explicit explanation. I didn't ask questions, and she didn't volunteer answers. But that woman had been through things that most people don't survive. The revelation that Sarah had been marked and scarred by. Experiences she'd never shared added new dimensions to Hollis's growing understanding of who she really was. The woman he'd known as Sarah McKenna had been someone in hiding, someone who'd chosen their isolated mountain community because it offered the kind of anonymity that meant survival. But if Sarah had been in witness protection or fleeing from criminal associates, then her disappearance took on entirely different implications. Instead of being a random victim, she might have been found by people who'd been hunting her for years. The blood in the snow and the abandoned truck might not have been evidence of abduction, but of assassination carried out by professionals who knew how to make people vanish without traces. As autumn painted the high country in shades of gold and crimson, Hollis found himself facing a truth that changed everything he thought he'd been searching for. Sarah McKenna might already be dead, killed by people whose patience had finally been rewarded after years of careful hunting. His 3-year quest might not be a rescue mission, but an extended funeral for a woman who died the moment her enemies discovered her location. Rue seemed to sense his master's growing despair. The old dog had become increasingly protective, positioning himself between Hollis and strangers, growing softly when anyone approached their camp. It was as if the husky understood that they were no longer just searching for Sarah, but had become targets themselves simply by asking the right questions in the wrong places. The torn photograph remained Hollis's most tangible clue, but it also represented everything he didn't know about the woman he'd loved. Who were the missing people from the right side of the image? What kind of life had required such careful documentation and systematic deception? And most importantly, was there anyone left who remembered Sarah not as an identity to be discarded, but as a person worthy of mourning? Winter was coming again, the 4th since Sarah's disappearance, and Hollis could feel his own strength beginning to fail. The years of searching had worn him down to something barely recognizable, a hollow man driven by obsession rather than hope. But he couldn't stop. Not when every new discovery suggested that Sarah's story was larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The mountains held their secrets closely, but Hollis was beginning to understand that some secrets were worth killing for, and that his methodical search had brought him close enough to the truth to make him expendable. The question was whether he'd find Sarah before her enemies found him, or whether the coming winter would claim 2 more victims to add to the high country's collection of unsolved mysteries. The blood-stained handkerchief lay crumpled in Hollis's palm like a promise of violence. He'd found it snagged on a low branch near the old mining road, its white cotton fabric marked with rust-colored stains that could only be one thing. After 3 years of searching, it was the first physical evidence that Sarah's disappearance had involved bloodshed. The discovery had changed everything about Hollis's approach to his investigation. Where once he'd knocked politely on doors and accepted evasive answers with frustrated resignation, he now pressed harder, asked more direct questions, and refused to be dismissed by people whose nervous behavior suggested they knew more than they were admitting. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by local law enforcement. Deputy Morrison had cornered him outside Mabel's diner during one of his increasingly rare visits to Silver Creek, his expression carrying the kind of official concern that Hollis recognized from his own days wearing a badge. "You're making people nervous." "Hollis," Tom had said, settling his considerable bulk onto the bench beside his former colleague. "Getting reports about you acting aggressive, making accusations. Some folks are starting to wonder if you've lost your objectivity about this whole situation." "Maybe objectivity isn't what's needed here," Hollis had replied, fingering the handkerchief through his shirt pocket. "Maybe what's needed is someone willing to push hard enough to get real answers. And maybe what's needed is for you to accept that some cases don't get solved. Some people don't get found. Tom's voice had carried the weight of 20 years in law enforcement, the accumulated wisdom of a man who'd learned when to let go. "You're chasing ghosts, and it's turning you into something your Sarah wouldn't recognize." But Hollis couldn't let go. Not when every instinct developed during his years as a sheriff told him he was finally getting close to the truth. The blood-stained handkerchief was proof that Sarah's disappearance hadn't been voluntary, that someone had hurt her badly enough to leave traces despite their obvious skill at making people vanish. His aggressive new approach had yielded results, though not the kind he'd hoped for. At a cabin near Copper Mountain, the owner had met him at the door with a loaded shotgun and instructions to leave immediately or face the consequences. Near Breckenridge, a man named Carl Brennan had threatened to call the authorities if Hollis continued harassing decent folks with his crazy theories. But it was Marcus Bell who represented the real danger. Though Hollis hadn't understood that until it was almost too late. He'd first encountered Bell at a roadhouse near Fairplay, an establishment that catered to the kind of men who preferred their business conducted away from official scrutiny. Bell had been playing poker in the back room, a lean man in his 40s with the kind of cold eyes that Hollis had learned to recognize during his law enforcement career. "You're the fellow been asking questions about that missing woman," Bell had said, not looking up from his cards as Hollis entered the smoky room. "Sarah something or other? Sarah McKenna. You know something about her?" Bell had smiled without warmth. "No, she was prettier than she was smart. Pretty women who ask too many questions. They sometimes find answers they don't like." The casual menace in Bell's voice had set every alarm bell in Hollis's mind ringing, but he'd pressed forward anyway. "What kind of answers?" "The kind that get people hurt. The kind that make families disappear in the middle of winter nights." Bell had finally looked up, his gaze carrying the flat indifference of a predator evaluating prey. "Smart folks learn to mind their own business. Folks who don't learn that lesson, they sometimes have accidents." Hollis had left the roadhouse with the uncomfortable certainty that he'd just met the man responsible for Sarah's disappearance, possibly for the other missing women as well. But certainty wasn't evidence, and his years in law enforcement had taught him the difference between knowing something and being able to prove it. The proof had come 2 nights later, when Rue's frantic barking had awakened Hollis from an uneasy sleep in their camp beside a mountain stream. The husky had been pacing the perimeter of their firelight, hackles raised and teeth bared at something moving in the darkness beyond the circle of illumination. Hollis had grabbed his rifle and rolled away from the fire just as the first shot shattered the silence, the bullet passing through the space where his head had been moments before. Training took over then, the muscle memory of a dozen dangerous situations during his sheriff years, guiding his movements as he sought cover behind a fallen log. "Should have minded your own business." "Sheriff," Bell's voice had called from the darkness. "Should have accepted that some women are better off forgotten." The gunfight that followed had been brief but vicious, muzzle flashes lighting the forest like deadly fireflies, while bullets whined through the pine branches overhead. Bell had brought backup, 2 other men who moved with military precision through terrain they obviously knew well. But Hollis had advantages they hadn't counted on: desperation, intimate knowledge of the specific terrain from months of camping in the area, and a dog whose loyalty transcended the normal bounds of canine devotion. Rue had made the difference, attacking one of Bell's companions with a ferocity that Hollis had never witnessed from the normally gentle animal. The husky's assault had disrupted their coordinated attack long enough for Hollis to gain a better position, turning the ambush into a running firefight that stretched through 2 miles of forest. When dawn finally broke over the high country, one of Bell's men was dead and the other was wounded badly enough to require immediate medical attention. Bell himself had escaped, but not before making it clear that Hollis's investigation had crossed lines that certain people considered uncrossable. "This isn't over," Bell had shouted from a rocky outcrop beyond rifle range. "You want to know what happened to your woman? Keep pushing, and you'll find out firsthand." The threat had followed Hollis and Rue back to Martha's cabin, where they'd recuperated while Hollis tried to process the implications of what had happened. Someone had been willing to commit murder to prevent him from learning the truth about Sarah's disappearance, which meant his 3-year search had finally struck close enough to matter. "They tried to kill you," Martha had said, cleaning a graze on Hollis's shoulder where one of Bell's bullets had found its mark. "That tells me you're asking the right questions. Getting close to answers they don't want revealed. But being close to the truth wasn't the same as having it. And Hollis knew that Bell's next attempt would be more carefully planned, more difficult to survive. The man had resources and backup that suggested connections beyond simple criminal activity. Whatever Sarah had been involved in, whatever she'd been running from, it was big enough and dangerous enough to justify ongoing violence against anyone who got too close. Rue had been wounded too. A deep gash along his ribs, where one of the attackers had managed to connect with a knife before the dog's teeth found his throat. The injury would heal, but it served as a reminder that Hollis's obsession was putting more than just his own life at risk. "Maybe it's time to walk away," Martha had suggested, watching Hollis tend to Rue's bandages. "Maybe Sarah's past is too dangerous for anyone to dig up and survive. But walking away would mean accepting that Sarah's killers would never face justice, that other women might disappear into the same network of violence that had claimed her. It would mean admitting that love wasn't strong enough to overcome the kind of organized evil that could make people vanish without consequences. The blood-stained handkerchief had become more than evidence. It was a promise that Hollis intended to keep no matter what it cost him. Sarah McKenna, or whatever her real name had been, deserved better than to be forgotten by a man who claimed to love her. She deserved the truth and the justice that should follow from it. As winter approached once again, Hollis knew he was facing a decision point that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. He could continue his search, knowing that Bell and his associates would escalate their efforts to stop him, or he could abandon Sarah's memory to the mountains and try to build something resembling a normal life from the ashes of his obsession. Rue made the choice for him, as he had so many times before. The old dog's eyes held a determination that matched his master's, a refusal to abandon the search that had defined their existence for 3 long years. Whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them together, as they had everything else since that terrible December morning when their world had changed forever. The identity papers were hidden in a place only someone who truly knew Sarah would think to look inside the false bottom of the jewelry box where she'd kept her grandmother's ring. Hollis found them 3 days after the gunfight with Bell's men. While searching the cabin they'd shared for anything that might explain why professional killers were willing to commit murder to keep her secrets buried. The documents changed everything he thought he knew. About the woman he'd loved, Sarah McKenna had never existed. The woman who'd served coffee at Mabel's diner, who'd planned their wedding for the meadow behind their cabin, who'd kissed him goodbye on that December morning 3 years ago, had been Elena Vasquez, a federal witness whose testimony had dismantled one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the Southwest. The witness protection file was comprehensive, detailing a life that read like something from a crime novel. Elena had been married to Miguel Vasquez, a mid-level operator in the Herrera cartel who'd made the fatal mistake of skimming money from his employers. When the cartel had discovered his theft, they'd made an example of him that involved 3 days of torture and a death, brutal enough to serve as a warning to others who might consider similar betrayals. Elena had witnessed her husband's murder from a hiding place in their attic, had watched while cartel soldiers dismembered the man she'd married and scattered his remains as a message to anyone else who might be tempted by easy money. But she'd also seen faces, had overheard names and locations, had absorbed enough information to bring down the entire network if she could be convinced to testify. The FBI had found her 2 days later, catatonic with shock and terror, clutching their 18-month-old daughter in a closet while the house burned around them. The child hadn't survived the smoke inhalation, another casualty of her father's greed and her mother's courage. Elena had traded her testimony for a promise that the men who'd killed her family would face justice. And for 3 years, she'd lived under federal protection while prosecutors built their case. But witness protection had its limitations, especially when the enemies involved had resources that rivaled small governments. The Herrera cartel had connections throughout law enforcement, informants who could track federal witnesses despite the government's best efforts to hide them. Elena's cover had been blown 6 months before the trial was scheduled to begin, forcing her to run from the very people who'd promised to keep her safe. That's when Sarah McKenna had been born, a carefully constructed identity designed to hide Elena Vasquez in a place where cartel soldiers were unlikely to look. Silver Creek had been perfect for the purpose, remote enough to discourage casual investigation, but populated enough to provide cover for someone who needed to blend into a community without attracting attention. The plan had worked for almost 2 years. Elena had found peace in her role as Sarah, had allowed herself to believe that love might be possible even for someone carrying secrets that could get people killed. She genuinely cared for Hollis, had imagined a future where Eleanor's past couldn't reach Sarah's present. But the cartel had never stopped looking, and they'd finally found her. The final document in the file was a letter addressed to Hollis, written in Sarah's careful handwriting, but signed with Elena's real name. She'd hidden it in the jewelry box as insurance, hoping he'd never need to read it, but knowing he deserved the truth if something happened to her. My dearest Hollis, if you're reading this, then my past has finally caught up with me, and the life we built together has ended in the way I always feared it would. I know you have questions, and you deserve answers, even though the truth will hurt more than the lies I've been telling. My name is Elena Vasquez, not Sarah McKenna. I've been running from people who want me dead because I witnessed things that could destroy them. I came to Silver Creek to hide, but I stayed because I fell in love with you in a way that made me forget why hiding was necessary. I never meant for you to be involved in this. I thought I could keep my 2 worlds separate, thought love might be strong enough to overcome the violence I was carrying. I was wrong, and I'm sorry for putting you in danger by being selfish enough to want happiness I didn't deserve. The men who killed my first husband, who murdered my daughter, they found me in December. They gave me a choice: come with them voluntarily and die quickly, or force them to hunt me through Silver Creek with the risk that innocent people might be hurt in the crossfire. I chose to go with them, but I left clues, hoping you'd understand that I didn't abandon you willingly. I don't know if I'll survive whatever they have planned for me, but I need you to know that every moment we shared was real. Sarah McKenna might have been a lie, but the love she felt for you was the truest thing in Elena Vasquez's broken life. Don't try to find me, Hollis. Don't try to avenge me if I'm dead. These people are too dangerous, too connected, too willing to kill anyone who threatens them. Live your life, find someone who can love you without bringing death to your door, and remember me as Sarah if you can manage it. I'm sorry for everything I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry for every lie I told to protect you from my truth. Most of all, I'm sorry that love wasn't enough to overcome the mistakes I made before I knew you existed. Forever yours, Elena. Hollis read the letter 3 times before his hands stopped shaking enough to set it down. The woman he'd been searching for had been dead for 3 years, killed by professionals who specialized in making problems disappear without traces. The blood in the snow had been Sarah's, Elena's, shed as a message to federal prosecutors that their star witness would never make it to trial. But even as grief threatened to overwhelm him, another emotion was building in Hollis's chest. Rage, pure and clean and focused on the men who'd taken everything from him twice, first when they'd murdered Elena's family, driving her into the false life that had brought her to Silver Creek, and again when they'd tracked her down and killed the woman she'd become. Marcus Bell hadn't been acting randomly when he'd threatened Hollis at the roadhouse. He'd been part of the cartel cleanup crew, tasked with eliminating anyone who might have learned too much about Elena's real identity. The ambush in the forest had been intended to tie up loose ends, to ensure that Sarah McKenna's secrets died with the man who'd loved her. But Hollis had survived, and now he knew the truth. Elena Vasquez had been murdered by the Herrera cartel to prevent her testimony from destroying their organization. The federal case had collapsed without their star witness, and the men responsible for multiple deaths had escaped justice through systematic intimidation and violence. Rue had been watching from his place by the fireplace, his intelligent eyes seeming to understand that their search had finally found its conclusion, though not the one they'd hoped for. The old dog whined softly and padded over to rest his head on Hollis's knee, offering the wordless comfort that had sustained them through 3 years of hunting ghosts. "She's gone, boy," Hollis whispered, scratching behind Rue's ears the way Sarah had done on countless evenings in this same cabin. "She's been gone since that December morning, and we've been chasing memories." But even as he spoke the words, Hollis felt something hardening inside him, transforming grief into purpose. Elena Vasquez had died trying to bring killers to justice, had sacrificed her life to protect the community that had become her home. The least he could do was ensure her death hadn't been meaningless. The federal prosecutors might have given up without their witness. But Hollis had spent 3 years gathering information about the network that had operated in these mountains. He knew names, faces, locations, enough to give law enforcement a starting point for finishing what Elena had begun. Marcus Bell and his associates had made a critical error when they'd tried to kill him. They'd revealed themselves as active threats rather than distant memories, had shown federal authorities that the Herrera cartel was still operating despite the collapsed prosecution. With Elena's testimony lost, her killers had become complacent, careless enough to leave evidence that could still be used against them. As winter settled over the Colorado mountains for the 4th time since Sarah's disappearance, Hollis began planning a different kind of search. Not for a missing woman who'd been found dead years earlier, but for justice that had been delayed too long. Elena Vasquez deserved to have her killers face consequences for the trail of blood they'd left across 2 states. And Hollis intended to make sure she got it. The identity papers went into his leather jacket pocket, next to the carved locket that had started his quest. Sarah McKenna's artifacts alongside Elena Vasquez's truth, carried by a man who'd loved them both without fully understanding either. The search was ending where it had begun, with secrets, violence, and the determination of someone who refused to let evil triumph through patience and intimidation. Rue stood and stretched, his old bones creaking with the effort, then moved to the door with the expectant patience of a dog who understood that their real work was just beginning. Elena's final letter lay folded inside Hollis's shirt pocket, positioned over his heart like a talisman against the darkness he was about to confront. He'd found it that morning, hidden in the one place she'd known he would eventually look, tucked inside the pages of the Bible she'd kept on their nightstand, marking the passage about justice rolling down like waters. The letter was different from the one in the jewelry box, written in those final hours before she'd walked out of their cabin to meet her killers. Her handwriting showed signs of the fear she'd been fighting to conceal, words occasionally shaky, but the message clear and devastating in its honesty. "Hollis, they found me. I can see them watching the cabin from the ridge. 3 men who've been hunting me for 2 years. I recognize Marcus Bell from the descriptions the FBI showed me during the trials that never happened. If he's here, then the others won't be far behind. I'm going to go to them willingly. It's the only way to keep you and the people of Silver Creek safe from what they'll do if they have to come get me. I've seen their work before. They don't care about innocent casualties when they want to make a point. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Don't look for me. Don't try to find my body. Don't let my death destroy the life you can still have. These people are professionals, Hollis. They've been killing federal witnesses for years, and they've never been caught because they're smarter and more patient than anyone hunting them. But if something happens to you, If you end up asking questions that bring them back to Silver Creek, then you'll need to know what you're really fighting. The Herrera cartel didn't die when Miguel was arrested. It adapted, evolved, became something worse. They have people inside law enforcement, inside the federal agencies, inside the prosecution offices. That's how they found me despite witness protection. That's how they've stayed ahead of every investigation. Marcus Bell runs their cleanup operations. He specializes in making federal witnesses disappear in ways that discourage others from cooperating with authorities. He's killed at least 12 people that I know of, probably more that were never connected to him. If you push him, he'll try to kill you too. But he has weaknesses. Bell operates out of a compound near the old Bristlecone mine, about 20 miles northeast of where you found my truck. The mine itself is abandoned, but he's built a private facility in the buildings that used to house the mining operation. He keeps records there, evidence of operations going back years. The FBI could use those records to rebuild the case against the cartel, to finish what my testimony was supposed to accomplish. I know you'll want to go after him. I know you'll feel like avenging me is the right thing to do. But please understand that this isn't about revenge. It's about preventing other women from dying the way I'm about to die. It's about making sure my daughter's death meant something in the end. If you decide to do this, you'll need help. Contact Agent Sarah Chen at the FBI field office in Denver. Tell her Elena Vasquez sent you and give her the location of Bell's compound. She's been hunting the Herrera cartel for 3 years, and she's one of the few federal agents I trusted completely. She'll know how to use whatever you can provide. I love you, Hollis. I loved you as Sarah McKenna, and I love you as Elena Vasquez. That love was the only real thing in my life for 2 years. And I'll carry it with me wherever I'm going. Don't let them win by destroying yourself, trying to save someone who's already lost. Elena. The letter had been accompanied by a detailed map of the area around Bristlecone Mine, showing access routes, defensive positions, and the approximate layout of the compound Bell had built in the abandoned mining facilities. Elena had been preparing for this confrontation long before her enemies had found her, gathering intelligence with the thoroughness of someone who understood that knowledge was the only weapon that might prove effective against superior numbers and resources. Agent Sarah Chen had been exactly what Elena's letter had promised, a federal investigator who'd been frustrated by the collapse of the cartel prosecution and eager for any opportunity to rebuild the case. She'd met with Hollis at a safe house outside Denver, bringing resources and expertise that transformed his personal quest into a legitimate law enforcement operation. Elena Vasquez was going to be our star witness, Agent Chen had explained, studying the map and documents Hollis had provided. Her testimony would have taken down not just the Herrera cartel, but the network of corrupt officials who've been protecting them. When she disappeared, we knew she'd been killed, but we could never prove it. Now you can. Now we have a chance. But it's going to be dangerous, and there's no guarantee we'll survive long enough to use whatever evidence we find. Chen was a small woman in her 30s, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous work. Bell's compound is essentially a fortress. Getting in alive will be difficult. Getting out with evidence will be nearly impossible. But Hollis had advantages that professional law enforcement couldn't match. He knew the terrain intimately, had spent 3 years learning every trail and hidden approach in the area. More importantly, he was motivated by something deeper than duty or career advancement. He was driven by love for a woman who'd died protecting people who'd never know her sacrifice. The plan they'd developed was simple in concept but complex in execution. A joint federal task force would position themselves around the compound's perimeter, while Hollis and a small team infiltrated the facility to secure the records Elena had described. The operation was scheduled for the new moon, when darkness would provide maximum concealment for their approach. Rue had been a constant presence during the planning sessions, the old dog seeming to understand that their long search was finally approaching its conclusion. His health had declined noticeably in recent weeks. The stress of their years in the wilderness had taken a toll that even his remarkable constitution couldn't overcome indefinitely. But his eyes still held the alertness of a working animal, and his devotion to Hollis remained absolute. "Your dog's getting old," Agent Chen had observed during one of their meetings. "Are you sure you want to bring him on something this dangerous?" Hollis had looked down at Rue, who was sleeping by the fireplace, but whose ears twitched at the sound of his name. The husky had been with him through every step of this journey, had saved his life more than once, had never wavered in his loyalty even when the search seemed hopeless. The idea of leaving him behind for the final confrontation felt like betrayal. "He's been hunting these people longer than any of us," Hollis had said. "He deserves to be there when we find them." But privately, Hollis worried that Rue's declining condition would make him a liability during the operation. The dog moved more slowly now. His breathing labored after minimal exertion, his once sure footing uncertain on difficult terrain. Age and accumulated injuries had reduced him from a capable partner to a beloved companion whose presence might endanger the mission they'd both sacrificed so much to reach. 2 days before the operation was scheduled to begin, Hollis had driven back to the cabin he'd shared with Sarah, with Elena, to collect the last of his gear and to say goodbye to the life they'd built together. The structure felt hollow without her presence. Empty rooms that echoed with memories of conversations they'd never finish and plans they'd never fulfill. But the cabin also held reminders of the woman Eleanor had chosen to become. During her time in Silver Creek, the garden she'd planted still showed signs of her care, wild now but recognizable. The porch swing where they'd spent countless evenings still creaked in the wind. The bedroom they'd shared still held the scent of the lavender soap she'd preferred. Sarah McKenna had been a fiction, but the love she'd felt for Hollis had been real. The life they'd planned together had been built on lies, but the happiness they'd found had been genuine. Elena Vasquez had died 3 years ago, but something of her continued to exist in the memories she'd left behind, and the determination she'd inspired in the man who'd loved both versions of her. As he prepared for what might be his final mission, Hollis carried Eleanor's letters, Sarah's carved locket, and Rue's unwavering loyalty. The search that had begun with a missing woman had evolved into something larger, a quest for justice that might finally allow both Elena Vasquez and Sarah McKenna to rest in peace. The mountains that had hidden so many secrets were about to reveal their most dangerous truth, and Hollis intended to be there to witness it, whatever the cost to himself or the dog who'd never left his side. Hollis's father's revolver felt heavier than memory suggested, its weight a reminder of responsibilities passed down through generations of men who'd worn badges and tried to protect people from predators that hunting season couldn't touch. The weapon had been his father's service piece during 30 years as a Colorado state trooper, carried through situations that had never made the newspapers but had shaped the man who'd raised Hollis to believe that some fights were worth the risks they demanded. The old Colt 45 had been retired to a gun safe after his father's death, a memorial to law enforcement service that Hollis had never expected to need again. But as he checked the cylinder one final time in the pre-dawn darkness outside Bristlecone Mine, the revolver felt like a connection to something larger than personal vengeance, a link to the idea that justice was worth pursuing even when the odds suggested that good men would die trying to achieve it. Agent Chen's task force had positioned themselves in the forests surrounding the compound. Federal agents armed with modern weapons and sophisticated communication equipment that made Hollis's revolver seem like an antique. But the old gun had advantages that newer weapons couldn't match: reliability earned through decades of use, and the kind of stopping power that ended fights decisively. "Remember, we need Bell alive if possible," Chen had whispered during their final briefing. His testimony could dismantle the entire network. But if it comes down to choosing between the mission and your survival, choose survival. Dead heroes don't testify in court. The compound had been built with security in mind, taking advantage of the natural defensibility that had made the mining operation profitable in its day. The main buildings were positioned in a natural depression, surrounded by rocky outcroppings that provided excellent fields of fire for defenders, while limiting approach routes for attackers. Bell had added modern security measures, motion sensors, cameras, and armed guards who moved through the facility with military precision. But Elena's intelligence had been thorough, identifying weaknesses that professional security might miss. An old mining tunnel provided access to the compound from the north, emerging inside the perimeter in a way that would allow a small team to bypass the main defensive positions. The tunnel was dangerous, unstable in places, prone to flooding, filled with the kind of toxic gases that had killed miners decades earlier. But it offered the only approach that wouldn't trigger immediate detection. Rue had insisted on coming despite his declining condition, the old dog's determination overriding Hollis's concerns about his ability to handle the physical demands of infiltration. As they crawled through the narrow tunnel, breathing air that tasted of earth and old death, Rue's panting seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. But his loyalty remained absolute, his willingness to follow Hollis into danger unchanged by age or accumulated injuries. The tunnel emerged in the basement of what had once been the mining office, now converted into a storage facility for the compound's operations. Hollis and the two federal agents with him, specialists in tactical operations whose names he'd never learned, moved through the darkened building with careful precision, following Elena's map toward the records she'd described. But Bell had been expecting them. The ambush came as they reached the main office, automatic weapons fire erupting from concealed positions throughout the room. One of the federal agents went down immediately, his body armor insufficient protection against the volume of fire directed at their position. The second agent managed to find cover behind an overturned desk, returning fire with controlled bursts that forced their attackers to keep their heads down. Hollis rolled behind a filing cabinet as bullets shattered the air around him, fragments of metal and wood creating a deadly storm that filled the room with the smell of cordite and fear. His father's revolver felt inadequate against the modern assault rifles their enemies carried, but it was what he had, and Elena's sacrifice demanded that he use it effectively. "You should have stayed away." "Sheriff," Bell's voice called from somewhere in the darkness, "should have let sleeping dogs lie instead of digging up graves that were meant to stay closed. Elena Vasquez deserved better than what you gave her," Hollis shouted back, trying to locate Bell's position by voice while conserving ammunition for shots that would count. Elena Vasquez got exactly what she deserved. What every federal witness gets when they think cooperation will save them. Bell's laugh carried the cold amusement of a predator who enjoyed his work. "She died begging, Sheriff, begging for you, for more time, for mercy that doesn't exist in my line of work." The words hit Hollis harder than bullets, images of Elena's final moments threatening to overwhelm his tactical awareness. But rage could be a weapon if properly controlled, and Hollis had been preparing for this confrontation for 3 years. Every door he'd knocked, every lead he'd followed, every night he'd spent sleeping on cold ground with only Rue for companionship had been building toward this moment. Rue made the difference, as he had so many times before. The old dog had circled around the room during the firefight, using shadows and furniture for cover while positioning himself behind their attackers. When Bell paused to reload, Rue, struck with the fury of an animal defending the only family he'd ever known. The husky's attack disrupted the coordinated assault, giving Hollis the opening he needed to advance on Bell's position. The man who'd killed Elena was younger than Hollis had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of hard competence that came from years of professional violence. But he'd made the mistake of underestimating the determination of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. The fight was brief and vicious. Bell was skilled with weapons and hand-to-hand combat, But Hollis had advantages that training couldn't provide: desperation, righteousness, and the accumulated strength that came from 3 years of hiking through mountain wilderness. More importantly, he was fighting for something larger than personal survival. When it ended, Bell was unconscious and bleeding from wounds that wouldn't kill him but would require immediate medical attention. The surviving federal agent was already calling for backup, requesting medical evacuation for his wounded partner and secure transport for their prisoner. But Hollis wasn't thinking about procedures or protocols. He was kneeling beside Rue, who'd collapsed after his attack on Bell. The old dog's breathing shallow and labored in a way that suggested internal injuries, too severe for field medicine to address. "Easy, boy," Hollis whispered, stroking the graying fur around Rue's ears. "Easy now. You did good. You did real good." Rue's mismatched eyes, one brown, one blue, focused on Hollis's face with the intelligence that had made him such an effective partner during their years of searching. The dog's tail moved slightly, a weak attempt at the enthusiastic wagging that had greeted Hollis every morning for the past 7 years. "I know, boy. I know you're tired." Hollis's voice broke as he realized this was goodbye, that Rue's final act of loyalty had cost him everything. "She's waiting for you, wherever dogs go when they're done being heroes. Sarah's waiting, and she'll take good care of you until I get there." Rue's breathing grew more labored, his eyes never leaving Hollis's face as life slowly drained from the body that had carried him through so much hardship and danger. When the end came, it was peaceful, the old dog simply closing his eyes and letting go of the life he'd spent in service to something larger than himself. Agent Chen found them 20 minutes later, Hollis still holding Rue's body, while federal agents secured the compound and began cataloging the evidence Elena's intelligence had promised they would find. The records were all there: years of cartel operations, lists of corrupt officials, financial records that would allow prosecutors to trace money and reconstruct criminal networks that had operated with impunity for too long. "We got them," Chen said quietly, settling beside Hollis in the debris-strewn office. "Bell's talking already, trying to cut a deal. The records here will let us roll up the entire organization. Elena's testimony won't be needed anymore. We have enough physical evidence to convict everyone involved." But Hollis barely heard her. He was thinking about the dog who'd never failed him, who'd followed him through 3 years of desperate searching, and had died protecting the mission that had defined both their lives. Rue had been more than a companion. He'd been a partner, a friend, a connection to the woman they'd both loved and lost. The search was over, but the price had been higher than Hollis had expected to pay. Elena was still dead. Bell's capture wouldn't bring her back. And now Rue was gone too, leaving Hollis alone with memories and grief that justice couldn't heal. The mountains that had hidden so many secrets had finally revealed their truth. But victory felt hollow when measured against everything it had cost to achieve. Sarah's wedding ring caught the early morning light as she pressed it into Hollis's palm, the simple band that had never made it to their planned June ceremony, now serving as both greeting and goodbye. She'd appeared at the edge of the compound like a ghost made flesh, moving through the federal agents with the kind of quiet authority that suggested she belonged there, that her presence was expected, even though it should have been impossible. "Hello, Hollis." Her voice carried 3 years of accumulated sorrow, the weight of choices that had saved lives but destroyed the future they'd planned together. "I heard you'd been looking for me." For a moment, Hollis thought grief and exhaustion had finally broken his mind, that the stress of losing Rue and confronting Bell had created a hallucination that would fade when he blinked or tried to speak. But Elena remained solid and real, older than memory suggested, marked by experiences that had carved lines around her eyes and added grey to the hair he'd once loved to touch. "You're alive." The words came out as statement rather than question, though his mind was still struggling to process the impossibility of her presence. Elena's letter said, "She said you were going to die." I was. I did, in a way, Elena settled onto a piece of debris beside him, close enough that he could smell the familiar scent of lavender soap she'd always preferred. Sarah McKenna died that December morning, just like I wrote in the letters. But Elena Vasquez survived long enough to finish what she'd started. Agent Chen had stepped back to give them privacy. But Hollis could see her speaking urgently into a radio, probably alerting her superiors that their recovered witness was alive and available for testimony. The implications would transform the federal case from an evidence-based prosecution into something much more powerful, a living victim who could put faces on the crimes and names on the perpetrators. I don't understand. Hollis was still holding the wedding ring, its weight somehow heavier than the revolver he'd carried into battle. The blood in the snow, the truck. Everyone said, I thought the blood was real, mine. Belle cut me to make the scene convincing, to make sure you'd believe I was dead. Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where a thin scar showed pale against her skin. They needed you to stop looking, needed the investigation to end so they could move their operations without interference. So they kept you alive? They tried to break me. 3 years of imprisonment, torture, psychological manipulation, designed to make me forget why I'd agreed to testify in the first place. Elena's voice remained steady, but Hollis could see the effort it cost her to speak about experiences that would haunt her forever. They wanted me to recant my testimony, to claim I'd lied about what I'd witnessed. But every time they hurt me, I thought about you, about Silver Creek, about the people I was protecting by staying silent. The revelation hit Hollis like a physical blow. While he'd been searching the mountains, following false leads and questioning innocent people, Elena had been suffering in captivity, enduring torture that was designed to destroy her will to resist. His 3-year quest had been doomed from the beginning, chasing shadows while the woman he'd loved was being systematically broken by professionals who specialized in making people disappear. I could have found you, he said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. If I'd pushed harder, been smarter, you would have died. Elena's hand covered his, warm and real and alive in a way that still seemed impossible. Belle had orders to kill anyone who got too close to the truth. The only reason you survived last night was because I'd been feeding information to Agent Chen, helping her coordinate the raid. You've been working with the FBI? For 6 months. Ever since I escaped from the facility where they were holding me. Elena's smile held no warmth. The expression of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required embracing darkness. Belle made a mistake when he brought me back to Colorado. He thought the familiar territory would break my spirit, make me more willing to cooperate. Instead, it reminded me why I'd chosen to testify in the first place. The escape had been as brutal as the captivity that preceded it. Elena had killed 2 guards and a driver during her breakout, using skills she'd learned during her marriage to Miguel Vasquez and refined during 3 years of imprisonment. The woman who'd served coffee at Mabel's diner and planted flowers in their cabin garden had become something harder, more dangerous, shaped by experiences that would have destroyed a weaker person. The woman you fell in love with, Elena said quietly, reading the questions in his eyes. She was real. Sarah McKenna might have been a cover identity, but the feelings were genuine. The love was genuine. The plans we made, the future we imagined, I wanted all of it more than I'd ever wanted anything in my life. Then why? Hollis stopped, realizing he already knew the answer. You can't come back. The trial starts in 3 weeks. My testimony will put 43 people in federal prison, including 5 government officials who've been protecting the cartel for years. After that, I'll disappear into witness protection again, and Elena Vasquez will become someone else entirely. The finality of it settled over them like winter cold. There would be no reunion, no return to the life they'd built in Silver Creek, no wedding in the meadow behind their cabin where the wildflowers bloomed each June. Elena's survival had come at the cost of everything that had made Sarah McKenna worth saving. I need you to know, Elena continued, her voice breaking slightly for the first time since she'd appeared, that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than watching Miguel die. Harder than losing our daughter. Harder than 3 years of captivity. But if I'd stayed, Belle would have killed everyone in Silver Creek to get to me. I couldn't let that happen. I know. Hollis closed his fingers around the wedding ring, feeling its edges cut into his palm. I read your letters, all of them. I understand why you made the choices you did. Do you forgive me? For the lies, for the pain I caused you, for destroying the life we could have had together. The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Forgiveness seemed inadequate to address the scope of what had been lost. But hatred would dishonor the love that had made their relationship worth remembering. Elena had made impossible choices in an impossible situation, and the consequences had fallen on both of them with equal weight. Sarah McKenna was the best thing that ever happened to me, Hollis said finally. If that woman was built from Elena Vasquez's dreams of a better life, then I'm grateful for every moment we shared. Every lie you told to make those moments possible. Elena's composure finally broke, tears streaming down a face that had learned to hide emotion as a survival mechanism. She leaned against him then, and for a few precious minutes, they held each other the way they had during those golden months when the future had seemed unlimited and love had felt strong enough to overcome any obstacle. But the moment couldn't last. Agent Chen was approaching, flanked by federal marshals who would escort Elena to a secure location where she could prepare for testimony that would reshape organized crime prosecution for years to come. The woman who'd been Sarah McKenna was about to become Elena Vasquez one final time, and then she would disappear forever into whatever identity the government created to keep her safe. Take care of yourself, she whispered as the marshals approached. Find someone who can love you without bringing danger to your door. Live the life we planned, even if you have to live it with someone else. Elena, her real name, felt strange on his tongue, weighted with meanings that Sarah's had never carried. I'll remember you, both of you, always. She kissed him then, soft and quick and final, the last kiss they would ever share. Then she was walking away with the federal agents, becoming smaller and more distant, until she disappeared into the vehicles that would carry her back into the shadows where witnesses lived and died according to the testimony they could provide. Hollis stood alone in the ruins of Belle's compound, holding a wedding ring that would never fulfill its purpose, and mourning a dog who died believing their quest had succeeded. The mountains that had hidden Elena's truth were already beginning to reclaim the facility. Weeds pushing through concrete, and weather starting to erase the evidence of what had happened there. The search was over, but the finding had brought more endings than beginnings. The new puppy's collar gleamed bright red against his black and white coat, a splash of hope in a world that had been painted grey for too long. Hollis had found the border collie mix at the same shelter in Leadville, where he and Sarah had discovered Rue 7 years earlier. Drawn by the same indefinable quality that suggested this particular animal understood something about loyalty that other dogs might miss. 6 months had passed since the raid on Belle's compound. 6 months since Elena had walked back into federal custody and out of his life forever. The trial had been a sensation, her testimony dismantling not just the Herrera cartel, but the network of corruption that had protected them for years. 43 convictions, including 3 federal agents and 2 prosecutors who'd been selling witness information for more money than their government salaries could provide. Marcus Bell had received life without parole, his cooperation in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, revealing the locations of 17 other victims whose families could finally have closure. The man who'd tortured Elena for 3 years had shown no remorse during sentencing, no recognition that his actions had destroyed lives beyond counting. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow when measured against everything it had cost to achieve. Hollis had resumed his position as sheriff of Silver Creek, though the man who'd returned to wear the badge was different from the one who'd abandoned it 3 years earlier. The townspeople had welcomed him back with the careful kindness reserved for someone who'd survived a tragedy that couldn't be discussed directly, treating him with respect while avoiding questions about his years in the wilderness. The cabin he'd shared with Sarah remained empty, too full of memories to serve as a home, but too precious to abandon entirely. He'd moved into a small apartment above the hardware store, close enough to his old life to maintain continuity, but distant enough to avoid the constant reminders of what he'd lost. Sometimes he visited the cabin to tend Sarah's garden, now wild, but still recognizable, keeping alive the memory of someone who'd believed in the possibility of creating beauty in harsh places. Rue's grave occupied a place of honor beside the cabin, marked with a simple stone that read, "Faithful Friend," in letters deep enough to survive mountain winters. Hollis visited regularly, bringing reports on cases solved and crimes prevented, maintaining conversations with a partner who'd earned the right to know how their work continued in his absence. The young dog, Scout, he'd decided to call him, showed promise of developing into the kind of companion that law enforcement required. He was intelligent, eager to please, and possessed of the alertness that suggested he'd inherited the working instincts his breed was known for. But he wasn't Rue, would never be Rue, and that was perhaps as it should be. Some partnerships were irreplaceable, meant to exist once and then live on in memory rather than attempted repetition. "He's got good instincts," Martha had observed, watching Scout investigate her cabin with the thoroughness of a dog, taking his responsibilities seriously. Different from Rue, but good in his own way, Martha had become a regular presence in Hollis's new life. Their friendship deepened by shared experience and mutual understanding of what survival sometimes cost. She'd been the first person to suggest that healing might require accepting help rather than pursuing solitude, that grief could be honored without becoming a permanent residence. "You're different now," she'd told him during one of their conversations by her fireplace. "Harder in some ways, but also more settled. Like you've made peace with truths that used to tear you apart." It was an accurate observation. The search for Sarah had taught Hollis things about himself that peacetime law enforcement had never revealed. That love could survive deception. That justice was worth pursuing even when it brought no personal satisfaction. That some forms of loyalty transcended the boundaries that normally defined human relationships. The work was different now, too. His years in the wilderness had sharpened instincts that made him better at reading people, at recognizing the signs that suggested hidden violence or concealed desperation. He'd solved 3 missing person cases in his first month back, applying techniques learned during his search for Sarah to situations where families needed answers that traditional police work couldn't provide. "You've got a reputation now," Deputy Morrison had mentioned during one of their patrols through the high country. "People from other counties are asking for your help with cases their own departments can't crack. Word is, you've got a special talent for finding people who don't want to be found." But Hollis's most important case remained unfinished in a way that would probably never be resolved. Somewhere in the federal witness protection system, Elena Vasquez was living another carefully constructed life, carrying memories of their time together while building relationships that could never approach the depth of what they'd shared. The woman who'd been Sarah McKenna existed now only in the hearts of people who'd known her, a ghost who'd left more impact on the world than most flesh-and-blood citizens could claim. The letters he'd written to her over the past 6 months remained unsent, stored in the same desk drawer where he'd once kept her photograph. Not because he didn't want her to read them, but because the security requirements of witness protection meant that any contact could endanger the life she'd fought so hard to preserve. Love sometimes meant accepting separation so complete that even well-intentioned communication became a form of betrayal. Scout padded over to rest his head on Hollis's knee, a gesture that echoed Rue's habits while remaining distinctly his own. The young dog had never known Sarah, would never carry the complex loyalties that had driven his predecessor through 3 years of desperate searching. But he offered something that Hollis had forgotten he needed, the possibility of forming new bonds that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. "What do you think, boy?" Hollis asked, scratching behind Scout's ears the way Sarah had done with Rue on countless evenings in their cabin. "Think we can make this work? Think we can do some good together?" Scout's tail wagged with enthusiastic approval, the response of a dog who'd found his purpose in the partnership that law enforcement provided. He couldn't replace Rue any more than another woman could replace Sarah, but he could offer companionship and loyalty that made the future seem possible rather than simply endurable. As autumn painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Hollis found himself standing at the edge of a different kind of search, not for someone who'd been lost, but for a way of living that could honor what he'd learned while embracing what he might still become. The scars would always remain, the memories would never fade, and some part of him would always wonder if Elena was safe in whatever life the government had created for her protection. But healing didn't require forgetting, and moving forward didn't mean abandoning the love that had defined the most important years of his life. Sarah McKenna had been real in every way that mattered, and the lessons she'd taught him about courage, sacrifice, and the price of justice would guide him through whatever cases the future might bring. The mountains that had hidden so many secrets were already preparing for another winter, snow beginning to dust the highest peaks with the promise of challenges to come. But Hollis no longer faced those challenges alone. He had Scout's companionship, Martha's friendship, and a community that needed the skills he'd developed during his years of searching for truths that others might prefer to leave buried. The badge on his chest caught the afternoon light as he walked back toward town, carrying the weight of authority that he'd earned through sacrifice rather than appointment. Behind him, Scout trotted with the confident gait of a dog who knew his place in the world and approved of what he'd found there. The search was over, but the work continued. Some mysteries were solved through persistence and courage, others through accepting that love could survive even the most complete forms of loss. Hollis had learned both lessons, and he carried them forward into a future that remained unwritten but no longer seemed impossible to face. In the distance, Silver Creek sparkled in the fading light, a community that had watched one of its protectors disappear into obsession and welcomed him back as something stronger than what he'd been before. The story that had begun with a woman's disappearance was ending with a man's return to the world of the living, scarred but intact, ready to serve justice in whatever form it might require. Scout barked once, a sound of pure contentment that echoed across the valley like a promise that some endings were also beginnings, that some losses prepared the heart for discoveries yet to come.